Welcome to my second lecture on Hesiod. Specifically, we're going to talk about Hesiod's works and days. Right now, this is Hesiod's second most famous work. In addition to the Theogony, he published, well, he didn't publish anything, but there are a couple other poems surviving by him, but these are his two most important ones, and the ones we're going to talk about. Pardon me, both these are foundational in the way that Herodotus was talking about, as setting the names and the functions and the basic ideas for all these major gods for people to come after Hesiod. So two foundational texts. So works and days. Two things to think about right now for this lecture. What is works and days? And what is the differences between works and days and the Theogony? So let's start with a little bit about works and days. It's another poem. It's not as long as the Theogony, and it's very not mismatched, but what's the word I'm looking for? It tackles very different topics in different parts of the poem. The Theogony is very much a genealogy from the beginning of the universe and the gods to basically where humans found themselves during the writing or during Hesiod's time. Works and Days covers a lot of different topics. As I noted here, over 300 lines of this poem are advice on farming techniques, like literal advice on farming techniques, like, you know, at the first frost, you should harvest your wheat or whatever like that. It literally farming techniques and advice. And I'll talk a little bit about that. We're not going to read that part. It's fun, and there's some interesting stuff there, but again, it's really not useful for anybody but a specialist at this point. So Works and Days is much more tied to earthly observations of Hesiod the farmer, and Hesiod was a farmer, shepherd, man of the earth, as well as a successful, skilled poet. He's also an unhappy litigant. He had some legal problems that involved his brother, as we'll see, Perses, who wronged him, he feels. Theogony is much more about the gods. Works and Days is about humans, very specifically. Works and Days became very popular as what's called pastoral poetry, so using the trappings of the simple life and shepherds to talk about complex issues. Later Greek and Roman poets, but even into English poetry on down the line, there's still people who practice the pastoral is still a genre that is influential, not as much as it used to be, but if you read early modern poetry like Marlowe and Raleigh, this pastoral setting and genre is still very much part of poetry. And Hesiod is the one who's credited with first making this popular in Works and Days and using this pastoral farming setting and theme to talk about issues. So, Works and Days, some scholars debate whether all of it was written by Hesiod, because it is very uneven, the topics that are covered. Some people argue, some historians and classicists argue that, this, what we call Works and Days, is just a mishmash of a bunch of his different poems put together. Maybe some of it was written by Hesiod, maybe some of it wasn't. The first part, especially the part about Prometheus, seems very familiar, very Hesiodian. What was I going to say here? Some people argue that the last sections of the works and Days are just an added supplement. Maybe they're written by him, maybe not. Maybe later people just tagged their stuff onto it and said it was Hesiod. This was not uncommon in the day. Remember, there's no printing presses. There's no copyright, anything like that. Any kind of written record would be handwritten on probably vellum at the time, like sheepskin, some kind of material like that, right? Printing presses didn't come around for a long time after the ancient Greek era. So written records would change copy by copy potentially. And anyway, and so people would add things in and just tag it to that writer, and that was not seen as necessarily a bad thing by other people as well. There was a very different idea about originality and publishing during pre-industrial times. So my own feelings are that the first part does feel like very similar to some of the things that are going on in the Theogony, and there's a real flow of ideas until you get to the part about the farming and the sea going and such, and perhaps that's additional. But I'm no archaeologist, so take it for what it's worth. We're not going to read that part because it gets pretty dull. Okay, so let's talk about the sections of Works and Days. Again, these sections I'm talking about are artificial demarcations that contemporary readers use to talk about the flow of ideas in this poem. So we have the Invocation of Muses again, just like we had in the Theogony. Much shorter this time, though, 10 lines. Just a very quick poem to Zeus, asking for his guidance, asking to be given the ability to, do justice to this theme. Then we had this meditation on the two kinds of strife that humans have to deal with. Then we get this myth of Prometheus and Pandora. And you might want to think about the juxtaposition of strife going into Prometheus and Pandora, very thematically relevant. And then we get this discussion of what's been called the 5 ages and the decline of humankind. So this might remind you a lot of the Christian Bible. It should, because there's a very similar theme, right? The story of Genesis is very much a story of the eras of humankind and their relationship with God and a falling away from God. And it's very much similar in Works and Days. Humans held a much more vaulted place next to the gods in these mythical pre-human ages, the Golden Age and Silver Age and such, as we'll see. Okay, so we get the 5 ages, very famous very famous schematic to talk about the history of humankind, very influential. And then it kind of shifts, the poem shifts a bit. We get this fable of the hawk and the nightingale, which is super interesting. Then we get this much more didactic section, which is Hesiod lecturing about human justice and Hesiod's specific problems with his brother. It gets kind of whiny at times. He's talking to Perseus, and just talking about their legal issues and why he's being why there's injustice and he feels wronged and so on. Some advice about living the good life, and then the works. So Works and Days. The first part is called the Days, the last part is called the Days. This part is called the Works. This part before is much more general and thematically broad, right? The Works is advice about farming and seagoing. Remember, seagoing was very important for the Greeks at the time. If you wanted to go anywhere, to go to market, to trade things, you might have to go by sea. So the Works, and it takes up hundreds of lines. And then the Days, which gets into advice and proverbs and just a bunch of random stuff. Another couple hundred words or 100 lines. So we're only going to read the first part. We're not going to read the Works and Days section, Works and Days proper section. So let me run through the sections quickly. Invocation of the Muses. Some things I want you to think about as you're reading through this. How is this section different than the first section of the Theogony? It's much shorter. So why is it much shorter? And why, what's going on in this section? Why do you think it's different? Why do you think he spends 1/10 of the time or the number of lines in this invocation of the Muses, right? The one in the Theogony is over 100 lines long. This one is just 10 lines. So why so brief compared to the Theogony, right? And what's the difference there? So try to compare those two and think about why it's different. 2, meditation on 2 kinds of strife. This part is interesting, very much. What you should be thinking about here is how this depicts Greek culture, because there's you can really get a lot about what Greeks thought about the world from this section. There are 2 kinds of strife, 2 kinds of difficulty. Strife just means difficulty that humans have to deal with. It's also kind of revolutionary because remember I was talking about the Mycenaean culture. Was apparently from what we understand was a very top-down warrior ethos kind of tribal culture where you had your warlord who was your kind of feudal lord over an area, and you were basically servants to the feudal lord. That's how we think the Mycenaean culture operated. So what Hesiod is outlining here is much more. I don't like to use the word democratic because it has specific political ramifications or meanings, but it is much more in that liberal sense where each person has a an individual voice and counts for something rather than just being a pawn in a larger game or the property of a lord or something. Okay, so think about that as you're reading through this two kinds of strife section. Then we get into the myth of Prometheus and Pandora. And think about Hesiod's attitude towards Prometheus. Does he like Prometheus? Because there are ways to read the Prometheus story where Prometheus is a hero who's defying the evil rules of the gods to bring technology and fire to humans. But does Hesiod think that? How does Hesiod depict Prometheus and why? You should look up Prometheus and Epimetheus. These two names, they're very interesting in what they mean. Sorry, the wind blew a door closed. Very windy here today. Okay, and then compare this version of the Prometheus Pandora story to the version in the Theogony. Why does he retell these stories? What is his obsession with this one myth? There are tons of myths he could use, right? He could tell this, any number of stories, right? But for some reason, he seems fixated on this Prometheus Pandora myth. So think about why that is and how they differ. Fourth section, the 5 ages. So what are those 5 ages? How is each characterized? And think about that falling away from God. Why does humankind fall away from God? The 5 ages, just to help you with that first question, the golden age, right? The golden age when humankind was, next to gods, the silver age, the bronze age, the heroic age, and the iron age. So we're in the iron age. The heroic age, this is the kind of Trojan War age, right? This is the age of Achilles and the great heroes of myth and legend, right? So think about this, why there's this falling away, and how this reflects maybe values in Greek culture. Okay, and then I think I've given you a bit of this, the fable of the hawk and the nightingale. This section is very short. 10 lines were used as a fable, right? And we were talking about that before, like an animal story with a moral. So it's a story about a nightingale. It's a story about might. You might want to think, how is power and strength depicted here? Is it okay that the hawk destroys the nightingale? Does he depict that as okay, or is it unjust? Right? You want to think about how he's using this fable, and part of that is how it leads into the next story, right? How it leads into thinking about human justice. And I think I gave you part of this section too, maybe just a few paragraphs if I remember correctly, just to give you a taste of what he's doing here, because he starts getting into justice. And what you want to think about with this first part of Works and Days is the flow of ideas, right? So invoking the Muses, that's he needs to set the stage and get the poetic authority to tell the story. Then he's talking about the problems that humankind has, the two kinds of strife, where that comes from, Prometheus and Pandora, how we've fallen away from God and from our holy place in the universe, and how that is part of the strife that we have to deal with. And then this meditation, this fable to talk about power and violence and justice, and then leads into more specific talk about justice in his specific case. So think about that flow as you're reading through. Okay, and then just quickly, I'll run through the last couple parts. There's advice on general on living, and he's supposedly writing to his brother Perseus. He's telling him just his ideas about living a good life. There's a whole section, almost 100 lines of him, offering morals to Perseus. So with some proverbs and some allegories, and a lot of it is very misogynist, right? Do not let a flaunting woman coax and cozen you and deceive you. She's after your barn. The man who trusts womankind trusts deceivers. And part of the question I ask you in the reflection this week is about misogyny, right? Then the works, again, you can go through this if you want and take a look at my notes just to get a taste of what's in those sections. But I just want to leave you with some thoughts on the differences between the Theogony and Works and Days. Theogony has this long, elaborate 100-line opening, focused on the gods. It has this more elevated tone. Prometheus is negative, and it's very misogynistic, right? There's very anti-woman. Women don't come off very well. Works and Days starts with a much shorter beginning, focuses on humans, much more personal tone, right? He's supposedly writing to his brother Perseus, but we also have Prometheus as a negative force, and women don't come off very well. So some things to think about as you read through Works and Days. Read through Theogony first, and then turn to the second one.